Deep in the forgotten valleys of the Appalachian Mountains, 12-year-old Tommy Mills has been surviving on his own for 3 years. Abandoned by his parents, who couldn't afford to feed another mouth, he learned to hunt, to forage, and most importantly, to build. What began as a desperate search for shelter has blossomed into something extraordinary. Tommy began collecting discarded materials from the valley below: rusted sheets of metal, weathered barnwood, broken furniture left behind by families who had moved on. With nothing but raw determination and an intuitive understanding of engineering, he has assembled something remarkable in a hidden grove, surrounded by ancient oaks. The structure defies all explanation. It's part treehouse, part sculpture, part home. It rises from the forest floor like something out of a fairy tale. Solar panels, salvaged from a defunct factory, power a string of LED lights that hang between hand-carved beams. But how did a child with no formal education create something that would challenge professional architects? Before we get back to that, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, make sure you're subscribed, because I have something very special in store for you tomorrow. 3 years earlier, a 9-year-old Tommy Mills sat on a cracked plastic chair outside Murphy's gas station, clutching a torn family photograph like a lifeline. His mother had told him to wait there while she used the restroom, but that had been 6 hours ago. The autumn sun was setting behind the West Virginia mountains, painting the sky the color of an old bruise. The photograph showed happier times. Tommy stood between his parents at a county fair, all three of them smiling into the sweet haze of cotton candy and carousel music. Now, the image was folded in half, splitting the family in two, just as reality had. His father had lost his job at the coal mine 8 months before, and his mother cleaned houses when she could find the work. 3 mouths to feed had become impossible with 2 empty hands. Tommy's stomach rumbled as he watched cars pull in and out of the gas station. Travelers bought snacks and drinks. Families drove off together, heading somewhere. Teenagers laughed in the back seats of pickup trucks. No one noticed the small boy with dirt under his fingernails and patches on his jeans, waiting for parents who would not return. As night fell, Murphy himself, a burly man with kind eyes, approached the boy. "Son, you've been sitting there all day. Where are your folks?" Tommy's voice was a whisper. "Mama said to wait. She's coming back." Murphy glanced at his wife through the plate glass window of the store, and Tommy saw the look that passed between them. It was the same look his school counselor had given his teacher when Tommy had fallen asleep in class one too many times. The same look the neighbors shared when they heard shouting from his family's trailer late at night. "Look," Murphy said gently. "Why don't you come inside? Get something to eat while you wait." But Tommy shook his head, loyalty and fear warring in his chest. If he moved from this spot, if he stopped believing, then it would be real. His parents would be truly gone. The mountains around him seemed to whisper ancient secrets as the night settled over the valley. For generations, these peaks had watched families scatter like leaves, coal miners searching for work, farmers abandoning depleted land, children growing up too fast in a place where opportunity died young. Tommy didn't know it, but he was stepping into a tradition as old as these hills themselves. By midnight, when the gas station closed and Murphy reluctantly called the county sheriff, Tommy had already made his decision. While the adults spoke in low voices about foster care and social services, the boy slipped away into the darkness, taking with him nothing but his torn photograph and a stubborn refusal to become another statistic in the system. That first night taught him that survival wasn't about comfort, but about making it to the next morning. He found shelter under an old railway bridge, using newspapers and cardboard from a dumpster to block the wind. The October air bit through his thin jacket, and every sound in the darkness made him jump. Coyotes howled in the distance, owls called from unseen perches, and something large crashed through the nearby brush. But when dawn broke, painting the mountains gold and purple, Tommy felt something unexpected: freedom. For the first time in months, no one was shouting. No one was crying over bills or drinking to forget their disappointments. The mountain air tasted clean, and the forest stretched out in every direction, offering possibility instead of limitation. He spent that first day exploring, following deer trails deeper and deeper into the wilderness. His small size became an advantage, allowing him to slip through dense undergrowth and navigate terrain that would challenge a grown man. By afternoon, he discovered something that would change everything: an abandoned logging camp, its buildings grayed by time and weather. The camp had been deserted for years, but tools still lay scattered about: a rusty axe with a loose handle, spools of old rope, metal buckets that could hold water. Tommy picked up each item with a sense of reverence, understanding instinctively that these objects could mean the difference between survival and surrender. In one of the dilapidated buildings, he found a priceless treasure: a wooden-handled spoon, hand-carved with simple but elegant lines. Someone had taken the time to shape this tool with care, to sand it smooth and carve small, decorative notches around the handle. It fit perfectly in Tommy's small hand. Holding it, he felt a connection to whoever had made it. It wasn't just a utensil. It was proof that even in the wilderness, even in hardship, people could create something both beautiful and useful. That night, Tommy carved his own name into the spoon's handle with a sharp rock, claiming it as his first real possession in this new life. As he fell asleep under a makeshift shelter of branches and a salvaged tarp, the spoon rested in his pocket like a promise. He was no longer just surviving. He was beginning to build. Tommy's first winter in the mountains taught him that nature was both a teacher and a trial. The abandoned logging camp became his base, but its decaying buildings offered little protection from the December winds that howled through the valleys like angry spirits. He learned to read the sky to predict storms, to find shelter in rock overhangs and dense pine groves, and to cache dry firewood in multiple locations. The compass he found among the logging gear became his most faithful companion. Its brass casing was tarnished and the glass was cracked, but the needle still pointed true north. More than a navigational tool, it became his anchor of hope, proof that even when all else seemed lost, some things remained constant and reliable. During those first difficult months, Tommy discovered the mountain's generous secrets. Wild onions grew in hidden meadows, their sharp flavor breaking the monotony of his survival rations. Persimmons clung heavy on the trees well into November, a sweet reward for climbing thorny branches. Creek beds revealed watercress and wild garlic, flavors that reminded him of his grandmother's cooking in better times. The rhythm of the mountains became his own. Dawn meant checking the snares he'd learned to build from rotted rope and bent wire. Midday was for exploring, following animal trails that led to water sources and natural shelters. Evening brought the careful work of building a fire and preparing food, skills that meant the difference between a restful night and a miserable one. Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. The snow melt turned gentle streams into raging torrents, washing away familiar landmarks and carving new paths through the forest. But the changing season also revealed treasures hidden under the winter's blanket. Road crews had dumped old equipment in remote areas, leaving behind materials that could be repurposed for shelter and tools. Tommy began to develop his own maps, scratching routes and resource locations onto pieces of tree bark with charcoal from his fires. The compass helped him maintain accurate bearings, but more importantly, it gave him the confidence to venture further from his base camp. Each expedition revealed new possibilities: a grove of wild fruit trees, a natural cave perfect for storing food, abandoned hunting blinds that could be salvaged for building materials. The boy who was once afraid of the dark now moved through the forest like a native. He learned to identify the bird calls that warned of an approaching storm, to recognize the rustling that meant deer, and the heavier tread that signaled black bears. His feet, toughened by months without proper shoes, could tread silently on leaf-strewn slopes. Summer brought abundance, and the first glimpses of human civilization beyond the mountains. From the high ridges, Tommy could see the valleys below, where small towns dotted the landscape like scattered seeds. Smoke curled from chimneys even in the warm weather, and the distant sound of traffic drifted on the still air. Sometimes, he'd catch the smell of barbecue grills or hear the sound of children playing, faint echoes of the life he'd left behind. But it was also in summer that Tommy made his most important discovery. Following a game trail toward one of the valley towns, he came across something that would change his entire perspective on survival. Strewn along a dirt service road were items the townspeople had discarded: broken furniture, rusted sheets of metal, old appliances that no longer worked. To the people who threw these things away, it was trash. To Tommy, it was a treasure trove. A sheet of corrugated metal could become a roof. Wooden chairs with broken legs could be disassembled for their sturdy backs and seats. Even rusty nails could be straightened and reused. That night, sitting by his fire with the compass in his hand, Tommy's had a profound realization. The needle that pointed north was like his own inner sense of direction. It didn't just show him where he was, but where he could go. And these discarded materials weren't just useful objects. They were opportunities to build something better than mere survival. He began to plan his first major construction project, sketching ideas on bark with bits of charcoal. Not just a shelter that would keep him alive, but a home that would prove he could thrive. The compass gleamed in the firelight, its steady needle pointing toward a future that suddenly felt full of possibility. As autumn approached, marking a full year since his abandonment, Tommy no longer thought of himself as a lost child waiting for rescue. He was a mountain dweller, a builder, a survivor who had learned to see opportunity where others saw only waste. The compass in his pocket pointed north, but his dreams pointed toward something even more ambitious: a structure that would showcase everything he had learned about turning nothing into something remarkable. By his second year alone, Tommy had grown 2 inches and gained lean muscle from the constant physical labor. His hands, once soft from childhood, were now calloused like someone who builds things for a living. More importantly, his mind had developed the kind of spatial reasoning that engineers spend years learning in school. The discovery of the perfect building site happened during an early morning hunt. Following a deer trail through a dense thicket, Tommy pushed through a curtain of wild grapevines and found himself in a hidden grove that took his breath away. Ancient oak trees formed a natural circle, their massive trunks creating walls and their interlocking branches forming a cathedral ceiling 50 feet above. The grove was about 30 feet across, with level ground that showed no signs of flooding, even after heavy rains. The morning sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, while the surrounding forest provided a natural windbreak. Most remarkable of all was a small spring that bubbled up from the rocks on the eastern edge of the clearing, providing a year-round source of fresh water. Tommy sat in the center of this natural sanctuary, turning slowly in a circle as his imagination went to work. He could see it clearly, not a crude survival shelter, but a real home that would complement rather than compete with the grove's natural beauty. The oaks would remain untouched, their massive trunks incorporated into his design as living pillars, supporting a structure unlike anything ever built. That night, by the light of his campfire, Tommy began his first architectural drawings, using a flat piece of bark as his paper and a charred stick as his pencil. He sketched his vision from multiple angles. The design that bloomed in his mind was a thing of both practicality and wonder. It was a multi-story structure that flowed around the ancient oaks like water around river stones, incorporating salvaged materials in a way that honored, rather than hid, their origins. The blueprint he etched onto a piece of bark that night would guide his hands for the next 2 years. Unlike the crude sketches he'd made before, this drawing showed a careful attention to the principles of engineering he had absorbed through observation and instinct. Load-bearing walls, proper drainage, structural joints that would allow the building to flex with strong winds instead of resisting them. His first major salvage expedition took weeks of planning. Tommy had watched the valley towns from high vantage points, learning the rhythms of their waste disposal. Thursday mornings brought garbage trucks to the residential areas, but more importantly, Saturday afternoons brought families cleaning out garages and basements, placing useful items on the curb for collection. Moving only at night, Tommy began his harvest. A wheelbarrow with a wobbly front wheel became his first vehicle, allowing him to haul heavy items up mountain trails during the dark hours when no one would see him. Trip after trip, he gathered the raw materials for his dream home. Corrugated metal sheets from a demolished barn would become weatherproof roofing. Wooden pallets discarded by a grocery store could be disassembled to provide hundreds of uniform planks. Most precious of all, he discovered a pile of concrete blocks behind a construction site. Solid building materials the contractor had abandoned when the project was finished. Each piece of reclaimed material told a story. The window frames from a house under renovation still held their glass, offering the possibility of natural light in his forest home. Copper pipes from a plumbing overhaul could be fashioned into a water collection system. Even broken furniture held value. Solid wood that could be reshaped, hardware that could be reused, designs that could inspire new creations. Tommy's approach to building defied conventional wisdom. Instead of constructing from the ground up according to standard plans, he designed around the materials he could find. When he discovered a cache of aluminum siding, his walls gained a reflective quality that would help regulate the interior temperature. Finding a roll of insulation meant his home could be comfortable year-round. The physical work of construction developed his body, while the mental challenges strengthened his problem-solving skills. How do you attach a wall to a living tree without damaging the bark? How do you create a foundation on uneven ground using only salvaged materials? How do you design a roof that sheds water but allows some rain to reach the roots of the trees below? Each challenge became a puzzle to be solved, and Tommy found that the solutions often came during quiet moments of reflection rather than through intense effort. The blueprint on the tree bark became his constant companion, marked with additions and modifications as real-world construction revealed new possibilities and limitations. By the time autumn arrived again, the basic structure of Tommy's house had begun to take shape among the ancient oaks. What was once an empty grove was transforming into something that belonged, as if the forest itself had decided to grow a human dwelling alongside its trees. The storm came without warning in late September, when Tommy was halfway through building the main frame of his house. He had been working since dawn, carefully setting salvaged wooden beams between the oaks. When the sky turned the color of old pewter, and the wind began to howl through the mountains like something wild and hungry, Tommy paid it little mind. He had weathered storms before, but this one felt different. The air pressure dropped so suddenly his ears popped, and the ancient oaks, which had stood for centuries, began to sway in a way that made the partially built walls groan and shift. The rain didn't fall. It attacked, blowing horizontally through the grove with enough force to sting his exposed skin. His first instinct was to save what he could. Scrambling across the construction site, Tommy grabbed his most valuable tools and materials, dragging them toward the natural shelter of a rock outcropping at the edge of the grove. But as he struggled to secure a sheet of corrugated metal roofing, a violent gust caught it like a sail, ripping him off his feet and throwing him against one of the oaks. Pain exploded in his left shoulder and shot down his arm, but there was no time to assess the damage. All around him, weeks of careful construction were being torn apart. Wooden beams he had spent days positioning were being lifted and tossed like matchsticks. Sheets of metal flew through the air like deadly frisbees, and his precious blueprint, tucked under a rock for safety, was in danger of being swept away forever. In desperation, Tommy dove for his emergency supplies. His fingers fumbled among his salvaged belongings until they found something he had almost forgotten. A small, battery-powered radio he'd found on one of his supply runs. He'd never been able to get it working properly. But now, soaked and panicked, he frantically twisted the dials and pushed the buttons. Static filled the air. Then, suddenly, a voice cut through the chaos of the storm. Emergency weather alert for all residents of Logan and Mingo counties. The National Weather Service has issued a tornado warning, effective immediately. Seek shelter in a basement or an interior room on the lowest floor of a sturdy building. The words hit Tommy like another physical blow. A tornado warning. He was alone on a mountainside with nothing but trees and half-built walls for protection. The radio crackled again. Voices discussed emergency shelters and evacuation routes for the towns in the valley below, reminding Tommy that somewhere down there families were huddling in safe places while he faced nature's fury utterly alone. But the radio also gave him something unexpected: perspective. As he cowered under his stone shelter, listening to emergency broadcasts and weather updates, Tommy realized he wasn't as isolated as he thought. The voices coming through the static were his neighbors, even if they didn't know he existed. Their concern for each other's safety extended to him, too. If only he could find a way to tap into it. The storm raged for 6 hours, reshaping the mountainside and testing everything Tommy had built. When dawn finally broke, revealing the damage in the gray morning light, Tommy's heart nearly broke with it. His carefully constructed frame was twisted and scattered. His stored materials were buried under fallen branches, and worst of all, his blueprint was gone. Snatched from its hiding place and carried away by the wind. His injured shoulder throbbed with every movement, but Tommy forced himself to survey the destruction methodically. Some losses were total. The metal sheets were blown too far to be recovered, and several wooden beams were cracked beyond repair. But other materials were simply displaced, not destroyed. Most importantly, the grove itself had survived, the ancient oaks proving their resilience against nature's assault. As Tommy picked through the rubble, he made a crucial discovery. The radio, though waterlogged and battered, continued to work throughout the morning. It brought news of the storm's aftermath. Roads were blocked by fallen trees. Power lines were down across the county, but there had been no loss of life. The valley communities were already organizing recovery efforts. Neighbors were helping neighbors clear debris and rebuild what the storm had taken. That afternoon, his arm in a makeshift sling fashioned from salvaged rope, Tommy began the process of redesigning his home. The storm had taught him that survival wasn't just about having a shelter. It was about building something strong enough to withstand whatever nature could throw at it. His new plans would incorporate storm resistance from the foundation up, using the oaks not just as architectural features, but as natural anchor points for a structure that could bend without breaking. The radio became his constant companion during the rebuilding process, providing weather updates that helped him plan his work schedule and emergency broadcasts that reminded him he was part of a larger community, even in his isolation. 2 weeks after the storm, while salvaging materials from a debris pile near the valley road, Tommy found something that stopped him in his tracks. Tucked between broken fence posts and soggy cardboard was a child's drawing, its crayon colors still bright despite being waterlogged and mud-stained. The picture showed a house with a crooked chimney, stick figures holding hands in a yard full of flowers, and at the bottom, written in careful block letters, "My family." And in the corner, Sarah, age 7. Tommy held the drawing with trembling hands, his mind racing with questions that had no comfortable answers. How had this gotten here? Where was Sarah now? Had another family been torn apart by circumstances beyond their control, their precious memories scattered to the wind like his own? He spent the rest of the day sifting through the debris, hoping to find more clues about Sarah and her family. But the drawing was alone among the wreckage of the storm, a single artifact of another person's life that had somehow found its way into Tommy's world. The more he looked at those cheerful stick figures, the more his own isolation pressed down on him like a physical weight. That night, sitting by his fire with the radio crackling softly in the background, Tommy found himself questioning everything about his existence on the mountain. For 2 years, he had told himself that solitude was freedom, that building his house alone was proof of his independence and strength. But Sarah's drawing forced him to face a different truth, that somewhere in the valley below, real families were making real memories together, while he was building a monument to his own abandonment. The radio brought voices of community members organizing cleanup efforts after the storm, checking on elderly neighbors, sharing resources with those who were left without power or water. Tommy listened to their easy camaraderie and wondered if he had made a terrible mistake by choosing isolation over the messy complications of human connection. For the first time since he'd walked away from Murphy's gas station, Tommy seriously considered going down to one of the valley towns and turning himself in. He could claim to be a runaway from another state, get placed in a foster home, maybe even find a family who wanted him. The drawing proved such families existed, people who drew pictures together and wrote their names with pride. But morning brought clarity, along with the sunlight that filtered through the oak canopy. As Tommy resumed work on his home, now redesigned to withstand future storms, he realized that Sarah's drawing hadn't shown him what he was missing. It had shown him what he was building. His house wasn't just a shelter for a lonely boy. It was becoming something that could welcome others, something that could create the kind of memories Sarah had captured in her art. That thought transformed his entire approach to construction. Instead of building solely for his own survival, Tommy began to incorporate features that would accommodate visitors. A second sleeping area tucked into the space between two oak trunks, a common area where people could gather around a central fire pit, and windows positioned to frame the most beautiful views of the surrounding forest. He carefully preserved Sarah's drawing, pressing it between pieces of tree bark to keep it flat and safe. It became his inspiration on the hard days, when construction setbacks made him question his vision. When a wall wouldn't line up correctly or materials proved unsuitable for his ambitious plans, Tommy would look at those stick figures holding hands and remember that he was building something bigger than himself. The drawing also changed his relationship with the communities below. Instead of seeing them as sources of materials to be scavenged in secret, Tommy began to understand them as neighbors he simply hadn't met yet. These were the people whose discarded materials were helping him create something beautiful. These were the families whose children drew pictures of homes filled with love. As autumn deepened and his house began to take its final shape, Tommy made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a few weeks before. When his construction was complete, when his sanctuary was ready to welcome others, he would find a way to reach out to the valley communities, not to surrender his independence, but to share what he had created. Sarah's drawing had taught him that the opposite of abandonment wasn't solitude, it was connection. His house among the oaks was becoming proof that even someone who had been thrown away could create something worth sharing. It was a place that could become the heart of new memories, a sanctuary for new families bound not by blood, but by a shared sense of wonder. By his third year in the mountains, 13-year-old Tommy had grown into his strength. Every day spent lifting, carrying, and building had sculpted him. His shoulders had broadened from hauling materials up steep mountain trails, and his hands now wielded tools with the quiet confidence of a seasoned craftsman. But his greatest achievement wasn't physical. It was the ingenious cart system he engineered to solve the problem of transporting heavy materials from the valley below. The cart was born of necessity and frustration. Hauling individual pieces up the winding mountain paths was exhausting and inefficient, severely limiting what he could accomplish during his nightly scavenging runs. He watched how water cascaded down the mountainside during heavy rains, always following the path of least resistance, and realized he could reverse that principle to pull heavy loads uphill. His design was brilliant in its simplicity. Using wheels salvaged from an abandoned shopping cart, axles fashioned from rebar found at a construction site, and a platform built from the sturdiest wooden pallets he could find, Tommy created a cart that could carry 10 times his own capacity. But the true innovation was the pulley system he rigged between the trees along his main route. The cart could be loaded at the base of the trail and then winched uphill using a network of ropes and pulleys that distributed the weight across several anchor points. What once took a dozen trips could now be done in 2 or 3, allowing Tommy to focus on the creative work of building rather than the grueling task of transport. The engineering challenge forced Tommy to think about physics in ways that would have impressed professional designers. He learned through trial and error how to calculate load distribution, how to position the wheels for maximum stability on uneven terrain, and how to devise braking systems that kept the carts from running wild on steep inclines. But the cart's success created an unexpected problem. With the ability to haul larger quantities of materials, Tommy's scavenging became more conspicuous to the communities in the valley. Residents began to report items missing from their curbside trash piles, and some started putting materials out only hours before the collection trucks arrived. Tommy adapted by expanding his territory, creating multiple routes through different towns and timing his collections to avoid detection. He learned the schedules of the garbage trucks, the habits of night shift workers, and the locations where construction crews dumped their surplus materials. The cart allowed him to venture farther from his mountain home, accessing richer sources of building supplies. His favorite hunting ground became the area behind Miller's Hardware, where the owner, an elderly man named Frank Miller, regularly tossed out damaged goods and outdated inventory. Tommy watched Frank from a distance, noticing the care with which he separated the materials, placing usable items apart from the actual trash, almost as if he understood that someone might find value in what he no longer needed. One autumn evening, as he was loading his cart with a collection of bent nails that could be straightened and reused, Tommy heard approaching footsteps. He froze, ready to abandon the cart and flee into the darkness. But Frank Miller's voice called out gently through the night air. "Son, I know you're there. I've been watching you take materials for months. You're not in any trouble. I'm just curious what you're building." Tommy remained hidden behind a stack of lumber, his heart pounding in his chest. Frank continued, as if conversing with the darkness itself. "Whatever you're creating up in those mountains, it must be something special. You have a good eye for materials, and you never take more than you need. That tells me something about your character." Frank produced a small flashlight, but instead of searching for Tommy, he illuminated a separate pile of materials. "I've been setting a few things aside I thought you might find useful. Good lumber, solid hardware, some electrical supplies that still work. They're yours if you want them. No questions asked." Tommy watched from his hiding place as Frank walked back to his store, leaving the flashlight on top of the pile like a beacon. The gesture was so unexpected, so generous, that Tommy felt tears well in his eyes for the first time in months. Here was proof that his instincts about the community were right, that kindness existed even for someone like him, someone living in the shadows. That night, Tommy filled his cart with Frank's gifts, but more importantly, he carried away the knowledge that his work was being seen and appreciated by at least one other person in the world. The great breakthrough came on a gray November morning, when Tommy discovered something that would transform his mountain home from an impressive shelter into a technological marvel. While exploring the far side of the valley, following rumors of an abandoned electronics factory, he stumbled upon a treasure that made his heart race with excitement. The factory had closed 2 years earlier, a casualty of foreign competition and a changing market. But the owners had simply walked away, leaving behind equipment and materials that represented thousands of dollars in investment. Most valuable of all were the solar panels, dozens of them, stacked on the loading dock, their dark surfaces unmarred by time or damage. Tommy had heard about solar power on the radio, listening to environmental programs that discussed renewable energy and sustainability. But to see the actual panels, to understand their potential, opened up possibilities he had never imagined. His home could have electric light, power for his tools, and perhaps even heat during the coldest winter months. The logistics of hauling the solar panels up the mountain challenged even his ingenious cart system. Each panel was larger and heavier than anything he had ever transported, requiring multiple trips and careful planning to prevent damage along the way. But Tommy met the challenge with the methodical patience that had become his trademark. He spent a week studying the panels, learning how they connected to each other and to the batteries and inverters that would store and convert their energy. The factory's abandoned office provided technical manuals and wiring diagrams that Tommy studied like sacred texts, absorbing principles of electrical engineering through sheer will and necessity. The solar panel installation became the most ambitious project of Tommy's young life. He designed a mounting system using salvaged aluminum frames and positioned the panels to capture maximum sunlight while remaining hidden from the casual observation of anyone who might venture into his grove. The work required him to climb high into the oak trees, securing mounting brackets and running electrical cables with the careful precision of a professional installer. And the first time Tommy flipped the switch and watched as LED bulbs illuminated his space, it felt as though he had performed magic. The warm glow transformed the oak grove from a woodland shelter into something that felt like a true home. But the solar system provided more than just light. It powered a small refrigeration unit he had salvaged from the factory, allowing him to safely store fresh food. Even more revolutionary was the water system Tommy designed around his solar power supply. Using electric pumps and pressure tanks, he created running water throughout his home, drawing from the natural spring and distributing it through a network of salvaged pipes. What had once been a primitive mountain encampment now featured modern conveniences that rivaled any home in the valley. The electrical system also powered communications equipment, an upgraded radio that could pick up multiple frequencies and, most importantly, a small weather monitoring station that gave him advanced warning of approaching storms. The memory of the tornado that had destroyed his first attempt at building drove him to create early warning systems that would protect both his home and his own safety. The winter months became productive, rather than merely endurable. Electric heat allowed Tommy to work on indoor projects during the coldest weather, while electric lights extended his working hours long into the night. He used this time to refine his living space, building furniture from salvaged materials and installing systems that would make his home comfortable for visitors. When it came time to reveal his creation, the solar array also represented a philosophical shift in Tommy's relationship with the natural world. Instead of simply taking what he needed from the environment, he was now harnessing renewable energy in ways that complemented, rather than competed with, the forest ecosystem. The panels were positioned to allow rainwater to reach the roots of the trees below, and their installation had required no cutting of living timber. Most importantly, the solar power system proved that Tommy's mountain home was more than a survival shelter. It was a demonstration of sustainable living that could inspire others. The same discarded materials that most people saw as worthless trash had been transformed into a fully self-sufficient home that generated its own power, collected its own water, and provided all the comforts of modern life, entirely off the grid. As winter deepened and the snow began to pile up around his grove, Tommy sat in his electrically heated home, surrounded by the warm glow of solar-powered lights, and realized he had achieved something remarkable. He had not just created a shelter, but a vision for how humans could live in harmony with nature while enjoying modern conveniences. His home among the oaks had become a masterpiece of appropriate technology, built entirely from things others had thrown away. The transformation began with a single green glass bottle, one that had once held wine, discarded behind a restaurant in the valley below. Tommy held it up to the afternoon sun, filtering through the oak canopy, and watched the emerald light dance across the wooden walls of his home. In that moment, he realized his home had evolved beyond a mere shelter, and even beyond a technological achievement. It was ready to become art. For months, Tommy had focused on function over form, ensuring his mountain home could provide warmth, power, and safety. But now, with winter approaching and his basic systems complete, he felt a pull to create something that would feed his soul as well as protect his body. The green bottle became the first piece of what would be his masterpiece, a stained glass window that would transform ordinary sunlight into cathedral-like beauty. Tommy began collecting bottles with the same systematic approach he had used for building materials. But now he sought color and clarity rather than simple utility. Beer bottles of amber and brown, wine bottles of deep green and clear crystal, medicine jars of cobalt blue. Each addition to his collection represented a different hue in the rainbow he was composing. Creating stained glass from salvaged bottles required tools and techniques Tommy had to invent from scratch. Using a small hammer and careful pressure, he learned how to break the bottles into manageable pieces while preserving their curved surfaces. Sanding the edges smooth became a meditative practice performed at night, as his solar-powered radio played classical music that seemed to guide his hands. The frame for the window came from an old church renovation, a Gothic arch that some contractor had discarded as outdated. Tommy had rescued it months earlier, not knowing exactly how he would use it, but now it seemed destined for this purpose. The pointed arch would become the focal point of his home's eastern wall, positioned to catch the first light of dawn and paint his living space with colored brilliance. Assembling the window required infinite patience. Each piece of glass had to be shaped to fit perfectly against its neighbors, creating patterns that were at once random and intentional. Tommy developed his own aesthetic philosophy during this process, coming to understand that beauty came not from perfection, but from the harmony of disparate elements working together. The window took 2 months to complete, working only during the daylight hours when he could see the true colors of his materials. As winter deepened around his grove, Tommy spent more and more time on this project, finding solace in the detailed work that demanded his full focus and pushed away any thoughts of loneliness or uncertainty about his future. When the window was finally installed and the morning sun shone through its colored panes for the first time, Tommy experienced something he had almost forgotten: pure joy. The eastern wall of his home became a canvas painted with light, casting rainbows across his carefully crafted furniture and walls. The colors shifted throughout the day as the sun moved across the sky, creating an ever-changing display that made his home feel alive. But the window accomplished something even more important than beauty. It announced to the world that this was not just a survival shelter built by a desperate child, but a work of art, created by someone who understood that humans need more than food and warmth to truly live. The stained glass window was a testament, proclaiming that its creator had not just survived abandonment, but had transcended it, transforming pain into something magnificent. The wilderness began to respond to the window's presence in ways that surprised Tommy. Birds that had once ignored his home now perched near the colored glass, as if drawn by its beauty. Squirrels and chipmunks seemed more at ease approaching the house, perhaps sensing that one who created such beauty was less likely to be a threat. The window also marked Tommy's evolution from builder to artist. With this project complete, he began to see artistic potential in everything around his home. Salvaged metal could become sculptures that complemented the forest scenery. Shards of colorful pottery could create mosaic paths between the oaks. Even functional elements like gutters and handrails could be designed with aesthetic considerations in mind. Most importantly, the stained glass represented Tommy's growing confidence that his creation was worthy of being shared with the world. Something so beautiful deserved to be seen, appreciated, and celebrated. As he sat in his solar-powered home watching the patterns of colored light on the walls, Tommy began to plan for the day he would invite others to see what he had made in his woodland hollow, hidden among the ancient oaks. The first sign that Tommy's secret was unraveling came on a cold March morning when he discovered fresh footprints in the mud near the entrance to the hollow. The prints were too large to belong to any forest animal, and their pattern suggested someone had stood still for a long time, perhaps studying the glimpses of his home visible through the bare winter trees. Tommy's heart pounded as he followed the tracks, which led to a punky outcrop that offered a clear view of his stained glass window. Someone had stood there, possibly for hours, watching the colored light dance through his creation. But more unsettling than the discovery itself was what the mysterious visitor had left behind. Tucked beneath the rock where the footprints ended was a folded piece of paper, weighted down by a small stone to keep it from the wind. Tommy's hands trembled as he unfolded what appeared to be a hastily written note. To whoever built this incredible home, you are not alone. Your work is beautiful and inspiring. A friend who understands. The words struck Tommy like a physical blow. After 3 years of total isolation, someone had found him, studied his work, and chosen to reach out with kindness rather than suspicion or alarm. The note was unsigned, offering no clue to the writer's identity, but the careful handwriting suggested education, and the message itself conveyed genuine appreciation rather than idle curiosity. Tommy spent the rest of the day in an emotional whirlwind, alternating between the thrill of finally being seen and the terror of losing his carefully guarded privacy. The note proved his home was visible to those who knew where to look, and that realization shattered his sense of security. If one person could find him, others could follow. He began to take defensive measures, building better camouflage screens around the hollow's perimeter and establishing lookout points where he could watch for intruders without being seen. But even as he worked to protect his sanctuary, Tommy found himself hoping the note's author would return. The loneliness he had managed to bury for months now came roaring back, fueled by the tantalizing possibility of human connection. The radio chatter from the valley towns had shifted recently, with increasing references to mysterious sightings in the mountain areas. Hikers reported glimpses of man-made structures in remote locations, and some described colorful lights visible through the forest at dawn. Tommy realized his stained glass window had become a beautiful but dangerous beacon for his continued secrecy. 2 weeks after finding the first note, Tommy discovered a second message. This one was left on a tree branch directly along one of his usual paths. The placement suggested someone had studied his movement patterns and knew exactly where he would find it. This note was longer and more detailed. Your solar panel array is brilliant. I'm an engineer, and I've never seen anything like what you've accomplished. Please don't be afraid. I just want to understand how you did it. The revelation that his visitor was an engineer left Tommy both thrilled and terrified. Here was someone with the technical knowledge to truly appreciate his innovations, but also someone with the authority to report unauthorized construction to government authorities. Tommy's mind reeled with questions about the engineer's motives and connections. That night, sitting in his home with the radio playing softly in the background, Tommy made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to hide, he would leave a note of his own, making contact with this mysterious admirer who seemed to understand and appreciate his work. Using his best handwriting on a clean piece of cardstock, Tommy wrote his reply. Thank you for seeing beauty instead of trouble. I built this because I had nowhere else to go, but it became something more. If you are truly a friend, come at sunset tomorrow, alone. He left the note at the base of the tree where the second message had appeared, pinning it with a piece of his own stained glass as a signature and a gesture of trust. The shard of colored glass would prove he was the house's true creator, while also offering a tangible piece of his art as a gift. As the sun dipped toward the horizon the next day, Tommy positioned himself in his highest lookout point, scanning the forest with binoculars he had salvaged from the electronics factory. His future hinged on what happened in the next few hours. He would either gain his first human ally in 3 years, or he would lose the sanctuary that had become his entire world. The woman who emerged from the forest at sunset was not what Tommy had expected. Dr. Elena Vasquez moved through the undergrowth with the careful precision shift of someone who understood wilderness protocols, carrying a bright orange backpack that immediately identified her as part of an organized search effort. The gear clipped to her pack, GPS devices, two-way radios, emergency flares, made Tommy's stomach clench with fear. Elena was in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the weathered skin of someone who spent a great deal of time outdoors. She wore the vest of a volunteer search and rescue coordinator, and Tommy could see official certification badges that signified training and authority. This was not a casual hiker who had stumbled upon his secret. This was someone with the power to change his life, whether he wanted it to or not. From his hidden perch in the oak canopy, Tommy watched Elena approach his hollow, with clear appreciation for what she was seeing. She lingered on every architectural detail, examining the solar panel array with professional interest, and running her fingers over the seams where salvaged materials had been fit together with impossible precision. When she reached the stained glass window, Elena stopped completely, pulling out a small digital camera to document what she was seeing. The sight of the camera sent a wave of panic through Tommy's chest. Photos meant evidence. Evidence meant authorities. And authorities meant the end of his mountain refuge. But Elena's behavior suggested something more complex than simple documentation. She spent long minutes studying the window's artistic patterns, and Tommy could see genuine emotion on her face as the colored light played across her features. This was not the clinical assessment of a government inspector. This was the reaction of someone who recognized and appreciated beauty. The two-way radio clipped to Elena's vest crackled to life, making both her and Tommy jump. A male voice emerged from the static. "Lena, this is base camp. What's your status in Grid 7? Elena glanced around the hollow, clearly torn between protocol and something deeper. After a long pause, she keyed the radio. Grid 7 shows no signs of recent human activity. Continuing sweep to Grid 8. The lie hung in the quiet air, as tangible as smoke from a campfire. Elena had just risked her professional reputation to protect Tommy's secret, and they both knew it. She looked up into the canopy of oaks where Tommy was hidden, speaking to the trees as if she knew he was listening. "I know you're up there. I've been tracking your movements for 2 weeks. I understand why you're hiding. But you need to know that people are looking for you now. Not just me, but official search parties. Someone reported unusual lights in this area, and the county sheriff is organizing a formal investigation." Tommy's world tilted on its axis. Everything he had built, everything he had achieved, was about to be swept away by forces beyond his control. But Elena wasn't finished. "I'm going to give you 48 hours to decide what you want to do. After that, I'll have to file my official report, and this place will be swarming with investigators. But if you're willing to trust me, there might be another way." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a folder filled with documents and photographs. Placing it carefully on the ground near Tommy's note, she continued her impossible offer. "I'm not just a first responder. I'm also a structural engineer. And what you've built here is extraordinary. These papers outline a legal process for getting retroactive building permits and establishing this site as an educational demonstration project. It would mean inspections and bureaucracy, but it could also mean you get to stay." Elena started walking back toward the edge of the forest, but stopped to deliver one final message. I was abandoned too, when I was 12. I spent 6 months living in a car before someone figured out how to help me without destroying what little independence I had left. Sometimes the system can work for people like us, but only if we're smart about how we approach it. The search and rescue gear on Elena's back caught the last rays of the setting sun as she disappeared into the trees, leaving Tommy alone with decisions that would determine his future. The manila folder lay on the ground like a bridge between his hidden world and the complicated reality of human civilization. That night, Tommy sat in his solar-powered home reading Elena's documents by the light of an LED bulb, while his radio picked up more and more chatter about search operations in the mountain areas. The legal paperwork was complex and intimidating, but it offered something he had never imagined possible: a path to legitimacy that wouldn't require abandoning everything he had built. The fever came in mid-November, striking with the sudden violence of a mountain squall. What began as a minor scratch from a piece of rusted metal became infected, then blossomed into something that set his entire body ablaze with fever, while his teeth chattered uncontrollably. Alone in his Oak Hollow sanctuary, with winter settling over the mountains like a frozen blanket, Tommy faced the first crisis his ingenuity could not solve. For 2 days, he tried to manage the illness with mountain remedies: willow bark tea for the fever, wild honey for the infected wound. But as his temperature soared and red streaks began to creep up his arm from the site of the injury, Tommy realized he needed medical supplies that couldn't be foraged from the forest or salvaged from construction sites. The decision to venture into Miller's Valley during daylight felt like a leap into the void. For 3 years, Tommy had moved through the towns only under the cover of darkness, an unseen shadow gathering materials no one else wanted. Now, sick and desperate, he was about to break the one fundamental rule that had kept him safe and hidden. The medical clinic sat on Main Street like a beacon of both hope and terror. Through the windows, Tommy could see shelves lined with antibiotics, bandages, and fever-reducing medicines, everything he needed to fight the infection that was poisoning his blood. But obtaining those supplies would require the most morally challenging act of his mountain existence. Tommy had never stolen anything of real value. His scavenging had always focused on the discarded, the things people had thrown away or left behind. But medicine was different. These supplies belonged to people who needed them, who had paid for them, who trusted they would be there in a time of crisis. The clinic's back door was surprisingly easy to bypass, secured by a simple lock that yielded to the techniques Tommy had learned out of necessity over the years. Inside, the medicinal smell hit him with physical force, antiseptic and sterile, speaking of healing and hope. His fevered mind struggled to focus as he searched the labeled cabinets for the antibiotics that could save his life. The bottles of pills felt impossibly heavy in his hands. Amoxicillin, the same antibiotic his grandmother had given him for childhood ear infections. Ibuprofen for the fever that was cooking his brain, and antiseptic cream for the wound that throbbed with every beat of his heart. Each stolen item was both salvation and damnation. Tommy took only what was absolutely necessary, leaving behind stronger drugs he didn't understand and supplies he could live without. But even his restraint couldn't change the fundamental nature of what he was doing. For the first time in 3 years of surviving on the mountain, he was carrying something that truly belonged to someone else. The journey back to his grove was a feverish haze of guilt and physical suffering. Each step on the mountain trail felt like climbing through quicksand, and twice Tommy had to stop and rest as his vision cleared and his stomach settled. The medicine in his pack seemed to grow heavier with every mile, weighed down by the moral compromise it represented. Back in his sanctuary of oak trees, surrounded by the beautiful home he had built from unwanted materials, Tommy forced himself to take the stolen antibiotics as tears of shame streamed down his feverish cheeks. The medicine worked quickly, fighting the infection and bringing his temperature down. But it could not cure the deeper sickness he felt for having violated his own ethical code. For a week, as his body healed and his strength returned, Tommy wrestled with what he had done. The medicine had saved his life, but at what cost to his soul? He had survived 3 years of hardship without compromising his basic decency, only to become a thief when faced with his first real crisis. The solution came to him during one particularly dark night when guilt made sleep impossible. If he had taken something of value from the community, then he needed to return something of equal value. But what could a 14-year-old hermit offer that would balance the scales of his transgression? The answer lay in his unique knowledge and skills. Tommy began to plan something unprecedented, a way to share what he had learned about sustainable living, about creating beauty from trash, about surviving and thriving on almost nothing. The medicine bottles sat on his shelf like accusers, but they also reminded him that sometimes survival demanded moral complexity, and redemption required action, not just regret. As winter deepened around his grove, Tommy began to design his greatest project yet. Not a building or an invention, but a gift to the community that had, unknowingly, sustained him for 3 years. The smell of smoke reached Tommy's grove at dawn, carried on winds that heralded a disaster brewing in the valleys below. By mid-morning, the scent had intensified, thickening into an acrid haze that made his eyes water and his throat burn. When Tommy climbed to his highest lookout in the canopy of the oaks, he could see the source of his growing alarm. A massive wildfire was crawling up the mountainside, a living thing ravenous for everything in its path. The radio crackled with emergency broadcasts as volunteer firefighters mobilized across 3 counties. Tommy listened with mounting horror as dispatchers coordinated evacuations, called for air support, and reported that the fire was moving faster than anyone had predicted. The drought conditions and high winds were turning what should have been a manageable blaze into a regional catastrophe. From his high perch, Tommy could track the fire's progress hour by hour. Orange flames crowned the treetops a mile below his grove, consuming everything they touched with terrifying efficiency. Plumes of smoke rose like twisted tornadoes, and the sound of burning timber carried on the wind like distant thunder. At this rate, the fire would reach his sanctuary by nightfall. But Tommy's home, built mostly of scrap metal and nestled among fire-resistant oaks, might just survive what wooden structures could not. His solar panels were mounted on steel frames, his walls were mostly aluminum and corrugated metal, and the grove's location provided natural fire breaks in the form of rock outcroppings and a spring-fed creek. As the afternoon drew the fire closer, Tommy made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of fleeing to safety, he began repairing his home to serve as a refuge for anyone who needed it. His solar-powered radio was picking up increasingly desperate reports of firefighters trapped by rapid shifts in wind patterns and civilians cut off from evacuation routes. The first refugees arrived just as the sun was setting behind a wall of smoke and flame. 3 volunteer firefighters, their yellow helmets blackened with soot, and their faces etched with exhaustion, staggered into Tommy's grove like survivors from a war zone. They had been fighting the blaze for 18 straight hours, when shifting winds trapped them on the wrong side of the flames, forcing them to seek shelter wherever they could find it. Captain Rodriguez, the crew's leader, stopped dead in his tracks as he saw Tommy's house emerging from the oak grove like something from a dream. His face, weathered by years of mountain firefighting, registered pure bewilderment at finding this architectural marvel in the middle of nowhere. "What in the hell is this place?" Rodriguez exclaimed, pulling off his helmet to reveal sweat and ash-matted gray hair. Tommy stepped out of his home, no longer a hiding hermit, but a 14-year-old boy offering sanctuary to weary heroes. "It's my home. The fire can't get you here. The metal construction and the spring water will keep you safe." The firefighters were too exhausted to question the impossible situation. Tommy led them inside, where solar-powered lights illuminated the smoke-darkened evening and clean water flowed from taps fed by the mountain spring. The men collapsed onto the furniture Tommy had crafted from salvaged materials, their relief at finding safety overriding their curiosity about their young host. As the fire raged through the surrounding forest, Tommy's grove became an island of calm in a sea of destruction. His metal-clad house reflected the heat without catching fire, and the spring that fed his water system continued to flow even as the forest around it burned. The three firefighters, awed by the innovative design of their refuge, began to realize they had stumbled upon something extraordinary. Throughout the night, Tommy's radio brought updates on the fire's progress and calls for missing personnel. When Captain Rodriguez identified himself and reported his team's location, the dispatcher's relief was audible even through the static. But more importantly, Rodriguez began to describe the remarkable structure that had saved their lives. "You need to send an engineer up here when this is over," Rodriguez said into the radio. "Some kid built something that could revolutionize how we think about fireproof construction in wildland areas." By dawn, standing in a landscape transformed by fire, Tommy realized he was no longer hiding from the world, but helping to save it. The helmet Captain Rodriguez placed on his table, scorched but still bearing its insignia of courage and service, represented Tommy's transition from isolation to heroism. He had spent 3 years building a refuge for himself, only to find that its true purpose was to provide refuge for others. The fire had destroyed thousands of acres of forest, but it had also revealed Tommy's sanctuary to the world in a way that could no longer be hidden or ignored. The helicopter arrived 2 hours after dawn, its rotors chopping through the smoke-filled air as it searched for the firefighting crew that had gone missing overnight. Tommy watched from his grove as the aircraft circled, the pilot following radio coordinates to locate Captain Rodriguez and his team. When the helicopter finally touched down in a nearby clearing, its arrival marked the end of Tommy's secret existence. Sheriff William Carson stepped out of the aircraft with the steady gait of a man accustomed to handling crises. A tall man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades dealing with mountain emergencies, Carson had been coordinating search and rescue operations in these hills for over 20 years. Behind him followed Dr. Elena Vasquez, her search and rescue vest identifying her as the engineer who had left those carefully worded notes weeks before. When Sheriff Carson saw Tommy standing beside his incredible house, the older man's expression moved through confusion, recognition, and finally, understanding. He pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket, a missing person flyer that had been circulated throughout the region 3 years prior. The photo showed a younger 9-year-old Tommy, smiling for the camera in a happier time. "Tommy Mills," Carson said, his voice heavy with the weight of a finally solved mystery. "Son, do you have any idea how many people have been looking for you?" The flyer in Carson's hand felt like proof of another life. The boy in the photograph belonged to a world of broken families and impossible choices, while the young man standing in the oak grove had built something extraordinary from the wreckage of that abandonment. Tommy looked at his own face, remembering the child who had waited outside the Murphy's gas station for parents who never returned. "I know," Tommy said softly, "but I found a better place than anywhere they could have taken me." Captain Rodriguez emerged from Tommy's house, still in his soot-stained uniform, but looking more rested than he had in days. He placed a protective hand on Tommy's shoulder as he addressed the sheriff. "Sheriff, this kid saved our lives. His home design is brilliant. A completely fire-resistant structure using nothing but salvaged materials. We need to be talking about what he's done here, not treating him like a runaway." Elena Vazquez was walking through Tommy's grove with professional fascination, examining the solar panel array and the innovative water systems that allowed the structure to function independently of all public utilities. Her engineer's eye assessed the load-bearing walls and structural joints that defied conventional building wisdom while achieving remarkable stability. "Sheriff," Elena called from beside the stained glass window, "this isn't just a shelter. It's a demonstration of sustainable architecture that could influence how we approach building in wildland areas. The county building department needs to see this." But Sheriff Carson was focused on more immediate concerns. The missing child report in his hand carried legal obligations that could not be ignored, regardless of Tommy's remarkable accomplishments. Social services, family court, and child protection agencies would all have jurisdiction over a 14-year-old who had been living on his own for 3 years. "Tommy, I understand you've built something incredible here," Carson said gently. "But you're still a minor, and there are people whose job it is to make sure you're safe and cared for. We have to follow certain procedures." The word procedures hit Tommy like a physical blow. After 3 years of complete independence, of making every decision about his own life and future, the prospect of being returned to institutional control felt like a death sentence. Everything he had built, everything he had learned, everything he had become, would be reduced to paperwork and case files. "What will happen to my home?" Tommy asked, his voice barely a whisper. Elena stepped forward, pulling documents from her pack. "That's where things get complicated. What you've built here has significant value, both architecturally and educationally. There are legal mechanisms to establish this site as a demonstration project, which could allow you to maintain some connection to it." She handed Tommy a thick folder containing building permits, proposals for educational programs, and legal frameworks that could allow his woodland sanctuary to transition from a secret refuge to a legitimate institution. The paperwork represented hope, but also the end of the simple life he had created among the ancient oaks. The missing person flyer remained in Sheriff Carson's hand, a reminder that Tommy's story had never truly been his alone. Somewhere out in the world, people had been searching, hoping, and refusing to give up on a 9-year-old boy who had vanished from a gas station 3 years before. The media circus began 3 days after the fire, when Captain Rodriguez's official report hit the regional papers and someone leaked photos of Tommy's incredible house to social media. By the end of the week, news vans were parked along every road leading into the mountains, and helicopter news crews circled overhead like mechanical vultures, searching for the perfect aerial shot of the miracle mountain house. Janet Torres, a veteran television journalist from the state capital, was the first to arrive with a full camera crew. Her bright red blazer and perfectly coiffed hair seemed absurdly out of place against the backdrop of the forest. But her questions revealed a genuine fascination with Tommy's accomplishment, rather than mere sensationalism. The camera she pointed at Tommy's stained glass window captured the light and color in a way that made his creation look even more magical than it was in reality. Tommy, can you explain to our viewers how a 14-year-old boy managed to create something that professional architects are calling revolutionary? Janet asked, as her cameraman circled to capture the house from multiple angles. Standing beside his sanctuary in the oak grove, Tommy struggled to find words that could convey 3 years of learning, building, and growing into someone he never expected to be. The camera lens felt like a microscope. The scrutiny of his soul, the sheer weight of strangers' attention, pressed down on his conscience like a physical burden. "I just used what people threw away," Tommy said, his voice a simple counterpoint to the growing complexity of his situation. As it turned out, there was far more value in those discarded materials than anyone had ever imagined. But the story had already outgrown Tommy's simple explanation. Online forums buzzed with discussions of sustainable architecture and off-grid living. Environmental groups hailed him as a young pioneer of ecological construction. Architects shared photos of his innovative designs and structural solutions. The house, once his private refuge, was becoming a symbol for movements he had never even heard of. Cameras documented every detail of Tommy's daily life. His salvaged solar panel generating clean electricity, his water systems delivering fresh mountain spring water, his ingenious waste management systems that left no environmental footprint. Every innovation born of necessity was now being analyzed as revolutionary technology, worthy of patent applications. Dr. Helena Vasquez became Tommy's unofficial spokesperson, translating the technical aspects of his construction for reporters who couldn't distinguish a load-bearing wall from a decorative element. Her engineering vocabulary lent gravity to accomplishments that might otherwise have been dismissed as the happy accidents of a creative child. "What Tommy has achieved here," Helena told the cameras, "represents a fundamental shift in how we think about sustainable building. He has proven that a sophisticated modern life is possible using only reclaimed materials and renewable energy sources." But the media attention brought complications that threatened to overwhelm Tommy's carefully ordered world. Reporters trampled through his forest, disturbing the wildlife and damaging plants he had spent years cultivating. Film crews left trash in pristine wilderness, and curious onlookers began arriving uninvited, hoping for a glimpse of the famous mountain house. Sheriff Carson found himself dealing with a traffic control nightmare, as news vans clogged the mountain roads and unauthorized helicopters violated restricted airspace. The very wildfire that had revealed Tommy's sanctuary still smoldered in distant valleys, but the media's focus had shifted entirely to the human interest story of the boy who built a masterpiece from trash. Tommy's sleeping loft became his fortress, a place to retreat from the constant intrusion of cameras and questions. The house that had been his peaceful refuge now felt like a museum exhibit, every corner scrutinized and discussed by strangers who saw inspiration where he simply saw the place he had learned to live. The most unsettling part of the media frenzy was how quickly Tommy's story was reshaped to fit convenient narratives. Some reports painted him as a victim of parental neglect, in need of immediate rescue. Others cast him as an environmental hero whose choices represented conscious activism. A few suggested he was a prodigy whose talents required institutional development. None of these versions captured the complex reality of a boy who had simply tried to survive and discovered in the process that survival could become art, that necessity could become innovation, and that loneliness could become preparation for community. The television camera recording his every word felt like a trap, turning spontaneous thoughts into public statements that would be dissected and critiqued by people who had never spent a single night alone in the wilderness. As the sun set over his grove of oak trees, painting his stained glass window with familiar colors, Tommy realized his life had entered a new phase, whether he wanted it to or not. The quiet mountain boy who had built beauty from refuse was becoming a public figure, his future to be shaped by forces as unpredictable as the fire that had revealed his secret to the world. The legal documents arrived in a manila envelope thick enough to choke a horse, delivered by a court officer who seemed as bewildered by Tommy's mountain sanctuary as everyone else who had discovered it in recent weeks. Judge Margaret Collins had ordered a comprehensive review of Tommy's situation, and the paperwork spread across his handmade table represented the most important decision of his young life. The documents detailed three possible futures, each with profound implications for both Tommy and his remarkable home. Option 1 was traditional placement in foster care, which would mean leaving his grove permanently and allowing the state to decide the fate of the property. Option 2 involved a supervised group home with other at-risk youth, offering some independence but ensuring adult oversight. Option 3 was unprecedented, supervised emancipation, which would allow Tommy to remain in his home under specific conditions. David Chen, the court-appointed lawyer for Tommy's case, was a soft-spoken man in his 30s who had spent his career helping children navigate impossible situations. Unlike the reporters and officials who had invaded Tommy's privacy, David approached the grove with an obvious respect for what had been accomplished there. "The judge wants to understand what you've built here before she makes any decisions about your future," David explained, taking a seat in one of Tommy's reclaimed chairs. "She's seen the photos and read the engineering reports, but she needs to hear from you what this place means." Tommy picked up the legal papers with hands that had learned to shape metal and wood, but had never before touched documents that could determine his entire future. The language was dense and intimidating, filled with terms like ward of the state, custodial rights, and asset disposition that reduced his 3 years of growth and achievement to bureaucratic categories. "What happens if I choose the emancipation option?" Tommy asked, struggling to grasp the legal terminology that described his potential freedom. David pointed to a section buried in the middle of the paperwork. "You would essentially become legally responsible for yourself, but with oversight from social services. You could stay here, but the property would need to be formally transferred into your name, and you'd have to prove you can support yourself financially." The financial requirements seemed impossible. Tommy's home was entirely self-sufficient, with no need for utility payments or a mortgage. But legal independence required documented income and formal ownership. His 3 years of successful survival meant nothing without the paperwork society demanded as proof of legitimacy. But the documents also revealed something extraordinary. The media attention surrounding Tommy's story had generated unexpected opportunities. Environmental organizations wanted to fund his home as a demonstration project. Architectural firms were offering consulting contracts for his innovative designs. Publishers were proposing book deals about sustainable living and teenage resilience. Most surprising of all was an offer from the county school system to establish Tommy's Grove as an outdoor learning lab, where students could study sustainable building, renewable energy, and environmental science. The proposal would provide Tommy with a steady income as an instructor, allowing him to share his knowledge with young people facing their own challenges. "There's something else you should know," David said, pulling out another set of papers. "We've located some of your relatives. Your mother's sister lives in California, and she's expressed an interest in offering support. If you're willing to reestablish contact." The possibility of family contact hit Tommy like a bucket of cold water. For 3 years, he had convinced himself that his abandonment was final, that no one from his past life cared enough to look for him. To discover that an aunt was searching for him, that family ties still existed somewhere beyond his mountain refuge, unlocked emotional doors he thought were permanently sealed. Tommy walked to his stained glass window, watching the afternoon light paint rainbow patterns on his carefully crafted furniture. The house that had been his entire world was transforming into something more. A symbol, a classroom, a bridge between the isolation he had known and the community he was beginning to understand he had always craved. The legal papers felt heavy in his hands, not because of their physical weight, but because of the life-altering decisions they represented. Each option offered different freedoms and different constraints, different opportunities and different risks. But they all acknowledged something Tommy had barely dared to hope for, that his accomplishments were valuable enough to be preserved, and that his voice was important enough to be heard. As night fell and David prepared to head back to town with Tommy's preliminary thoughts, the boy who had spent 3 years making every decision alone realized he was about to enter a world where choices were shared, where support was available, and where his remarkable house among the oaks could become the foundation for something even more extraordinary than solitary survival. The Millers Valley Courthouse had never seen anything like the crowd that gathered on the morning of Tommy's hearing. Judge Margaret Collins looked down from her bench at a packed gallery that included firefighters, environmental activists, social workers, architects, and reporters from 3 states. But Tommy's eyes were fixed on something far more personal, a small, golden key he had fashioned from reclaimed brass and copper, now resting on the table before him like a talisman. The key had taken 3 sleepless nights to create, forged in a makeshift foundry, built from materials he had collected over the years. Every curve and tooth was shaped by hand, polished to a warm sheen that reflected the courtroom's fluorescent lights. It was both functional. It unlocked the front door of his mountain home, and symbolic, representing his choice to unlock a future that balanced independence with community connection. Prosecutor James Whitney represented the state's position that Tommy, despite his remarkable achievements, was still a minor in need of protective custody. Whitney's arguments focused on safety concerns and educational requirements, painting Tommy's mountain existence as a dangerous isolation that had deprived him of a normal childhood development. Your Honor, Whitney argued, while we all admire this young man's ingenuity, we cannot ignore the fact that he has lived without proper supervision, medical care, or formal education for 3 critical years of his development. But Tommy's defense team, led by attorney Sarah Martinez and supported by the technical testimony of Dr. Helena Vasquez, presented a radically different perspective. They argued that Tommy's accomplishments demonstrated not just survival skills, but advanced knowledge in engineering, architecture, environmental science, and sustainable living that surpassed most high school graduates. When Judge Collins called Tommy to the witness stand, the packed courtroom fell silent. The boy who had spent 3 years speaking only to trees and forest animals now faced the challenge of explaining his choices to a room full of strangers whose decision would determine his future. Tommy, Judge Collins said gently, I've read extensive reports about what you've accomplished, but I need to hear it from you. Why should this court allow you to continue living independently? Tommy held the handmade key, feeling its warm weight in his palm, and found words that came from 3 years of solitary reflection and hard-won wisdom. Your Honor, when my parents left me at that gas station, I thought my life was over. I thought being thrown away meant I was worthless. But living in the mountains taught me that nothing is worthless if you know how to see its potential. He gestured toward the photographs of his home that lined the courtroom walls, images that captured the beauty he had created from materials others had discarded. I built my house from things people didn't want anymore, but I also built myself from someone nobody wanted. If you put me in foster care or a group home, you'll be saying that who I've become isn't good enough, that 3 years of learning and growing and creating something beautiful doesn't matter, because I did it without permission. The courtroom remained utterly silent as Tommy continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke of the knowledge he had gained and the community he wanted to serve. I'm not asking to be isolated forever. I want to share what I've learned. I want to teach other kids that being thrown away doesn't mean you're useless. My house can become a place where young people learn that they can build their own futures, that they can take the broken pieces of their lives and make something incredible. Judge Collins studied the golden key in Tommy's hands, understanding its symbolism even before he explained its meaning. I made this key myself, Your Honor, using skills I learned out of necessity. It opens the door to my house, but more than that, it represents my choice to open that door to others. I'm not asking for the right to hide anymore. I'm asking for the right to share. The judge called for a brief recess, during which Tommy sat surrounded by the supporters who had become his community. Helena Vasquez, Captain Rodriguez, David Chen, and dozens of others who saw the value in his achievements. The golden key was passed from hand to hand, each person recognizing its craftsmanship and understanding its meaning. When the court reconvened, Judge Collins delivered a verdict that acknowledged both Tommy's remarkable accomplishments and the complexity of his situation. Supervised emancipation would be granted, but with conditions that would transform his mountain refuge into something greater than he had ever imagined, a bridge between the isolation that had shaped him and the community that would define his future. A year later, Tommy Mills stood in his sanctuary at Oak Grove, watching a group of elementary school students from 3 counties as they explored the sustainable living techniques that had once been his secret methods of survival. At 15, he had grown into his role as an instructor and guide. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had learned profound lessons out of necessity and chosen to share them out of love. The guest book, resting on a table crafted from reclaimed barnwood, told the story of this transformation through its hundreds of signatures. Environmental scientists from universities, architects seeking inspiration, families learning about sustainable living, and most importantly, young people who found hope in Tommy's story of turning abandonment into achievement. 13-year-old Emma Rodriguez, daughter of the fire captain who had first found Tommy, carefully signed her name after completing a week-long summer program. Her entry read, "This place taught me that being different doesn't mean you're broken, and that the most beautiful things come from seeing possibilities where others only see problems." The educational program that had grown around Tommy's home now offered year-round workshops on sustainable building, renewable energy, and environmental stewardship. But the deeper curriculum was about resilience, about understanding that circumstances do not define potential, and that creativity combined with determination can transform any situation. Tommy watched as Emma and her classmates worked on their own small construction projects, using salvaged materials to build birdhouses and garden planters under his guidance. The students came from various backgrounds, some from stable families seeking an environmental education, while others coming from the foster care system or difficult home situations, needed to see that survival could become an art. "Remember," Tommy said to the group, as they fitted pieces of recycled sheet metal onto their projects. "Every piece of material has a story and a potential purpose. Our job isn't to judge what something was, but to see what it can become." The grove itself had evolved while maintaining its essence, Additional structures now provided classroom and workshop space, all built using Tommy's principles of sustainable construction and aesthetic integration with the natural environment. Solar panels generated enough electricity to power the educational facilities, and the water systems had been expanded to accommodate larger groups while retaining their eco-friendly design. Dr. Helena Vasquez, now a technical consultant for the program, approached Tommy with news that had become almost routine, yet never lost its thrill. The University Extension Service wants to add our curriculum to its official environmental education catalog, she said, and 3 other states are interested in replicating the program. But Tommy's greatest satisfaction came from the individual stories of transformation. Michael Santos, a 16-year-old from the foster care system, had spent the summer in the Grove learning construction skills and discovering that his history of moving between homes had given him an adaptability that could be a strength. Maria Chang, who was dealing with financial hardship in her family, learned that knowledge of renewable energy could lead to scholarship opportunities and careers she had never imagined. The guest book chronicled these stories in handwritten entries that Tommy read every night, understanding that his choice to open his home had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond his mountain refuge. Teachers brought their students to learn about innovation and self-reliance. Social workers referred young people who needed to see examples of resilience in action. Families visited to understand how they could reduce their environmental impact while building stronger connections with the natural world. As the afternoon sun painted familiar rainbows across his stained glass window, Tommy reflected on the journey from a 9-year-old boy abandoned at a gas station to a 15-year-old teacher whose story was inspiring communities across several states. The abandoned child had become a builder of bridges, connecting people to possibilities they never knew existed. The day's last guestbook entry came from Mrs. Peterson, the elderly neighbor who had admired Tommy's roses during his years of secrecy. Her words captured something essential about the transformation that had occurred. This place proves that the most valuable things in life are not bought or inherited, but built with love, patience, and the courage to see the beauty in what others overlook. As night fell over the grove, and the day's visitors returned to their homes, carrying with them new knowledge and inspiration, Tommy began planning the next day's lessons. The boy who had learned to survive alone now taught others that survival could become community, that creativity could become a curriculum, and that the deepest education came from understanding that every person, like every discarded material, held unlimited potential waiting to be discovered and developed. The guest book would receive many more signatures in the years to come, each one adding to the growing testament that sometimes the most extraordinary achievements begin with the simple decision to keep building, keep growing, and keep believing that tomorrow can be better than today.